There is a particular kind of silence that follows a man who has lost everything. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of rest. Something heavier than both. The silence of a life that has been emptied out and has not yet found anything new to hold. It follows him into rooms. It sits beside him at the kitchen table. It is there when he wakes at 3 in the morning and stares at the ceiling and tries to remember what it felt like to have somewhere to be. Robert Callahan knew that silence intimately. He was 61 years old, and in the space of 14 months, he had lost his job, his marriage, his house, and the version of himself he had spent 3 decades carefully building. He had not lost them carelessly. He had not gambled them away or thrown them aside in a moment of recklessness. They had simply gone, one after the other, in the slow and unstoppable way that things go when the ground beneath a life shifts and nothing you do is quite enough to keep your footing. The job had gone first. 28 years as a senior project manager at a construction firm in Portland, Oregon, a firm he had joined at 33 when it had 12 employees and a rented office above a hardware store. A firm he had helped grow to 400 people in 3 state offices, pouring into it the best hours of the best years of his life. When the new ownership came in and the restructuring began, and his name appeared on the list, he had been genuinely and completely blindsided. He had been the kind of man who believed that if you worked hard enough and delivered consistently enough, the work itself was its own protection. He discovered at 59 that this was not true. The marriage had not survived the job loss. This was not, if he was honest, entirely the job loss's fault. The marriage had been struggling quietly for years, one of those slow, undramatic deteriorations that happen when 2 people grow in different directions and are too busy to notice until the distance between them has become too wide to cross comfortably. His wife, Sandra, had stayed through the first year of his unemployment. She had been patient and supportive in the way of a woman trying very hard to do the right thing. But there were conversations they could not seem to have, silences that had calcified into walls, a fundamental disconnection that the unemployment had not created, but had made impossible to ignore any longer. She had moved out on a Thursday in November. She had been kind about it, which in some ways was harder than anger would have been. She had told him she still cared about him. She had told him she hoped he found his way. She had meant both things, and he had known she meant them. And he had stood at the window and watched her car disappear around the corner and felt the specific, bottomless vertigo of a man watching the last familiar thing leave his life. The house had gone 2 months later, a house he had lived in for 19 years, a house where his daughters had grown up, where Christmas mornings had happened, where the garden had been a project he and Sandra had built together over years of weekend afternoons. The bank had been patient. He had not been able to be patient enough in return. He moved into a 1-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city. It was clean and quiet and entirely without character, which suited him because he was clean and quiet and had lost, temporarily or permanently he did not yet know, most of his own character as well. He was not a man given to self-pity. This is important to establish. He had not spent his life expecting things to be easy, and he did not now sit in his characterless apartment feeling sorry for himself in the dramatic, consuming way of people who have decided that the world owes them something it has failed to deliver. What he felt was quieter than self-pity, and in some ways harder to manage. It was the feeling of irrelevance, the feeling that the shape he had occupied in the world, the specific outline of Robert Callahan, husband, homeowner, senior manager, man with a desk and a schedule and a place in the organizational chart of things, had been erased, and what remained was simply a man with a body and a history, and no clear sense of what either of them was for anymore. He was 61 years old. He looked at 61 and could not see the shape of what came next. The conventional story, the one he had been living without quite noticing he was living it, had run out of road. He had done the career. He had done the marriage. He had done the house and the lawn and the daughter's school plays and the annual vacations and the slow, incremental building of a life that looked, from the outside, like exactly what a life was supposed to look like. and now it was gone. And he was 61, and he did not know what Act 3 was supposed to be. His daughters called. Emma, 32, in Chicago, Lily, 29, in Denver. Both called twice a week with the careful, loving attention of children who are genuinely worried about a parent and trying not to show the full extent of it, because showing the full extent of it might make things worse. He told them he was fine. He was, in the narrow sense of the word, fine. He was not collapsing. He was not in danger. He was simply waiting. Waiting in the suspended, purposeless way of someone who has no idea what they are waiting for. He walked. This was the main thing he did with his days in those first months. He walked the streets of Portland for hours, not with any destination in mind, not as exercise with a fitness goal attached, but simply because walking required nothing of him except that he put one foot in front of the other, and this was about all he felt capable of requiring of himself. He walked past his old office building twice, on 2 different days, and stood on the sidewalk outside it for longer than was comfortable, and then walked away. He walked past the house on Birchwood Drive, once, late at night when he was sure no one would see him, and looked at the lights in the windows and felt something that had no clean name. He walked along the river in the early mornings when the city was still quiet, and the water was the color of pewter, and the only sounds were the birds and the distant hum of the first traffic and his own footsteps on the path. He was waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for something to happen. He had been waiting for 4 months when it did. It was a Tuesday in February. He was walking the river path, as he had taken to doing most mornings, when he noticed the community garden. He had walked past it a dozen times without really seeing it. It was set back slightly from the path, behind a low wooden fence, a patchwork of small plots in various states of winter dormancy, bare earth, a few dead stalks, the occasional brave patch of something green pushing through the cold. A hand-painted sign on the gate read, "Riverside Community Garden, new plots available, inquire within." He had no particular interest in gardening. He had maintained the lawn at Birchwood Drive because it needed maintaining, not because it had ever given him joy. He had never grown food. He had never felt the pull toward soil that some people describe, the primal satisfaction of planting and watching and harvesting. But he stopped at the gate. He did not know why. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the bare plots and the hand-painted sign, and felt something stir that had not stirred in 4 months. Not excitement, not hope. Something earlier and smaller than either of those. A faint, quiet flicker of curiosity. He pushed open the gate and walked in. The woman he found inside was not what he expected, though he had not expected anything in particular. She was perhaps 70, small and compact, with cropped white hair, and the kind of deeply weathered outdoor complexion that comes from a lifetime of caring more about being outside than about what the outside does to your skin. She was crouching beside a raised bed, doing something with a small trowel, and a seriousness of focus that suggested she had entirely forgotten there was a world beyond the 12 square feet in front of her. She looked up when she heard the gate, with the unhurried attention of someone who is never startled because they are always paying attention. "Help you?" she said. Not unfriendly, direct. "I saw the sign," Robert said, "about the plots." She studied him for a moment with the frank, assessing gaze of a woman who has reached an age where she sees no point in being less than direct. "Ever gardened before?" "Not really," he said. "Good," she said, which was not the response he had expected. The ones who've never done it properly are easier to teach than the ones who think they know and don't. She stood up with the careful, practiced movement of someone who has learned to treat her joints as partners rather than servants. "I'm Ruth." "Robert," he said. "Plot 7 is open," Ruth said. "Come back Saturday morning at 9 if you want it. I'll show you what to do." She went back to her trowel without waiting for his response. He came back on Saturday. It was the first morning in 4 months that he had somewhere to be. He had built his identity, he understood now, almost entirely around function, around what he did rather than who he was. This is not unusual for men of his generation and his type. men who came of age in a culture that measured worth in output, in production, in the size of the thing you managed and the number of people below you on the org chart. He had absorbed that measurement system so completely that he had confused it for a self. And when the function was removed, when the title and the desk and the schedule and the business card were taken away, what remained felt dangerously thin. He tried in those first months to solve the problem the way he had always solved problems, with a plan. He updated his resume. He reached out to contacts. He attended 2 networking events and stood in the middle of rooms full of people, doing the specific performance of professional optimism that networking events require, and felt, both times, that he was watching himself from a slight distance, like a man who has forgotten the lines to a play he used to know by heart. The contacts were kind. The conversations were warm. Nothing came of any of it, and after a while he stopped trying. Not because he had given up exactly, but because the trying felt like trying to re-enter a burning building. The version of his life that had existed inside that building was gone. He did not yet know what existed outside it. His daughters visited in those first months. Emma came for a long weekend in January and cooked for him and cleaned the apartment with the gentle, purposeful efficiency of a child caring for a parent and trying to make it look like something else. Lily flew in for his birthday in March and took him to dinner at a restaurant nicer than he would have chosen for himself, and talked brightly and warmly about everything except the things that were hardest to talk about, which was the right instinct, even if it left some silences unfilled. He was grateful for both of them. He was also, under the gratitude, quietly ashamed, the specific shame of a father who has always been the steady one and is now visibly unsteady, who has always been the one his daughters could call and is now, clearly, in need of being called. He knew this was not a rational shame. He knew that being human and being in difficulty are not failures. He had told students this. He had believed it when he told them. Believing it about yourself is a different and considerably harder thing. Plot 7 was 8 feet by 12 feet of hard, compacted winter soil that had not been worked in 2 seasons. It looked, that first Saturday morning, like an unpromising rectangle of nothing much. Ruth stood beside him and looked at it with him for a moment. "What do you see?" she asked. "Dirt," he said. "Potential," she said. "Same thing, from the right angle." She handed him a spade and showed him how to turn the soil, not just breaking the surface, but going deep, lifting and turning, breaking up the compacted layers, introducing air into a medium that had been closed and static for too long. It was hard work, harder than it looked, and within 20 minutes he was breathing heavily, and his lower back was registering its opinion of the proceedings in emphatic terms. He kept going. He was not sure why. The work itself was simple to the point of being primitive, a man with a spade turning dirt, and yet there was something in it that held his attention in a way that nothing had held his attention for months. The resistance of the soil, the satisfying heaviness of each turned clod, the smell of it, cold and dark and alive in a way he had not expected. Ruth worked beside him on her own plot, largely in silence, which was how he came to understand, over subsequent Saturdays, that silence was her natural medium. She was not unfriendly. She was not cold. She simply did not feel compelled to fill space with words, and in the first weeks this suited Robert perfectly because he did not have words that seemed worth saying. She taught him things as they became relevant: how to test soil acidity, how to read the angle of the light to understand which parts of his plot would get the most sun at which times of day, how to plan a layout that took into account what each plant needed from and gave to its neighbors. It was more complex than he had imagined, and the complexity interested him in the way that a new system always interests a man who has spent his career managing complex systems. He began to understand that a garden is not a collection of plants. It is a system of relationships. The garden had 12 plots in total, and over the first weeks of spring, he came to know the people who tended them. There was Frank, 68, a retired electrician who had been coming to the garden for 11 years, and who had the easy, particular confidence of a man who is very good at something that most people are too impatient to be good at. Frank grew tomatoes with a devotion that bordered on the religious, and spoke about soil composition with the fluency of someone who has read everything there is to read on the subject and has also done all the reading the soil itself has to offer. There was Helen, 54, who worked as a nurse and came to the garden on her days off because, she said, she spent her working hours surrounded by what the body does when it fails, and she needed somewhere she could watch things grow. She had a gift for coaxing life from difficult conditions. The shady corner of her plot that everyone said would never produce anything had become, under her care, a thriving patch of herbs and leafy greens. There was George, 41, who had moved from the East Coast 2 years ago, and who was, Robert recognized with a jolt of familiarity, in the particular liminal state of a man who has left one life and has not yet fully arrived in the next. George worked his plot with the slightly desperate energy of someone using physical labor to manage an anxiety that has no other outlet, and Robert felt toward him the specific, rueful affection of a man who recognizes himself. These people, and the others, became over the spring something Robert had not expected: company. Not the performance of company, the polite maintenance of social connection that he had been going through the motions of since his world came apart. Real company. The kind that forms naturally, without effort, between people who share a task and a place and the particular weather of a given morning. He had not realized how much he had missed it. He had been, in his professional life, surrounded by people, meetings and conference calls and the constant buzzing activity of a large organization. But surrounded by people is not the same as connected to them. He had been surrounded and, he now understood, largely alone inside the surrounding. The garden gave him something different, the unhurried, unperformative connection of people who are doing something real together. Ruth was the center of it, though she would have denied this emphatically. She had been coming to the garden for 19 years. She was, to the other gardeners, the keeper of institutional knowledge, the person who remembered what had been tried and what had failed, and what the particular microclimate of the riverside location required that no gardening book would tell you. She remembered the names of everyone's plants. She noticed when a plot was struggling before the person tending it had admitted it to themselves. Robert came to understand, slowly, that Ruth was also watching him. Not intrusively, not in the way of someone managing a project, in the way of someone who has seen many things and has developed, through seeing, a very clear eye for what a person needs before the person has worked it out themselves. She began, in her oblique and unsentimental way, to push him. "Your tomatoes need more support," she told him one morning, gesturing at the stakes he had put in. "You've given them just enough to get by. Give them what they actually need." He had a feeling she was not only talking about the tomatoes. "Your rows are too neat," she said another time. "You're managing the plot like a spreadsheet. Let some things find their own way. Not everything needs to be controlled to grow." He heard it both ways every time. He suspected she intended it both ways every time. One Saturday in May, when the plot had transformed from a rectangle of hard dirt into something green and evidently alive, he stood at the edge of it and felt something that took him a moment to identify. It was pride. Not the brittle, performance-dependent pride he had grown accustomed to in his professional life, the pride that needed quarterly results and positive feedback to sustain itself. Something different, something that came from the ground up, literally. He had put things in the earth and they had grown. The earth had cooperated. He had shown up consistently with what was needed, and the result was in front of him. It was the simplest version of what he had been doing for 28 years, and somehow, in its simplicity, it felt more real. He told Ruth about the job on a Wednesday morning in June. He had not planned to. They were working in companionable silence, as they often did, and something about the morning, the warmth of it, the smell of the soil, the particular quality of ease that had developed between them over 5 months of shared labor, made the words come without his planning them. He told her about the 28 years, about the restructuring, about standing in his manager's office while a man 12 years younger than him explained with genuine but useless sympathy that Robert's position had been eliminated. About the particular humiliation of being handed a box for your things and escorted to the elevator by HR. He told her about Sandra, about the marriage that had not survived the earthquake, and about his inability to be entirely certain whether the earthquake had caused the collapse or merely revealed a structure that had been weakened for years. He told her about the house, about standing on the sidewalk outside it at night, looking at the lights in the windows. Ruth listened without interrupting. She continued to work while he talked, which he found, to his surprise, made the talking easier. The movement gave his hands something to do, and his eyes somewhere to be other than on her face. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "How long ago did all this happen?" she asked. 14 months, he said. 14 months from the job. The marriage and the house came after. "And before you found the garden?" 4 months of walking, he said. "Walking is good," she said. "Walking is how you keep moving when you don't know where you're going yet. The garden is what you do when you're ready to stay still long enough to start something." He looked at her. "I lost my husband 14 years ago," she said, without preamble. "I lost my job 2 years after that. I was a landscape architect. The firm folded. I lost the house we had built together the year after that." She said it with the calm of someone who has metabolized old pain into something useful. "I found this garden on a February morning, walking the river path. I had no interest in gardening. I saw the sign." Robert stared at her. "The same sign?" "A different sign," she said. "Same gate." She went back to her work. "You're not the first person this garden has caught, Robert. You won't be the last." That evening, walking home along the river path in the long June light, Robert turned over what Ruth had told him. She had lost the same things he had lost, in almost the same order, and she was 70 years old. And she came to the garden 4 mornings a week, and she was the most quietly alive person he had encountered in years. Not alive in the loud, performative way of people who have decided to make their resilience into a brand. Alive in the deep, grounded way of someone who has found the thing that holds them and holds it without drama or announcement. He thought about what she had said, that walking was how you kept moving when you didn't know where you were going, that the garden was what you did when you were ready to stay still long enough to start something. He had been ready, he realized, to start something. He had walked until he was ready, and then he had walked through a gate and found a rectangle of hard dirt and a woman with a trowel who had told him it was potential. She had been right, he thought. She was right about most things. He was beginning to understand that the most important things she was teaching him had nothing to do with tomatoes. The work itself surprised him most. He had expected the garden to be peaceful. He had not expected it to be demanding. But a garden, he discovered, is relentlessly honest. It does not respond to good intentions or positive thinking, or the kind of optimistic projection that had, he now realized, characterized a good deal of his professional life. It responds to what you actually do. The soil does not care about your 5-year plan. The plants do not care about your track record. They care about water and light, and whether the soil has what they need, and whether you showed up this week and did the work. There was something clarifying about this. After years in an environment where outcomes were shaped by politics and relationships, and the management of perception as much as by actual competence, the garden's blunt causality felt almost like relief. You did the right thing, or you did not. The evidence was in front of you. There was no spin. He started arriving earlier than he needed to, not just on Saturdays, but on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, before work had once occupied those hours, and before he had found anything to replace it. He would let himself in with the key Ruth had given him after the 3rd week, a gesture of trust so casual it had moved him more than she would ever know, and work in the early quiet before the other gardeners arrived. He found that he liked this hour best. The garden before anyone else was in it had a particular quality of stillness that reminded him, in some way he could not quite articulate, of Sunday mornings before his family had woken, a time that had always felt like his own, in a way the rest of the week was not. The surprise did not arrive dramatically. It did not arrive all at once, or on a single identifiable morning that he could later point to and say, "There, that was the moment everything changed." It arrived the way most real things arrive, slowly, incrementally, in small daily installments that only become visible as a pattern when you step back far enough to see the shape of them. The first installment was the harvest. In late July, Plot 7 produced its first real yield. Not the tentative early greens of April and May, which had felt more like proof of concept than actual abundance, but a genuine, substantial harvest. Tomatoes, more than he could eat alone. Zucchini, which he had planted too enthusiastically on Frank's advice, and which were now producing with an energy that bordered on aggressive. Beans, lettuce, herbs he had grown because Ruth had told him to, and that he was now using daily in ways he had not cooked before. He began giving the excess away to Helen, who brought it to the hospital break room, where it was consumed with the grateful speed of people who spend long shifts largely on vending machine food. To George, who was going through a difficult stretch, and whose own plot was suffering from the distracted tending of a preoccupied mind. To the family in the apartment above his, whom he had barely spoken to in 6 months of living there, and who, when he knocked with a bag of tomatoes, looked at him with the surprised warmth of people who had stopped expecting their neighbors to be human. He had not anticipated this, the social dimension of having something to give. He had spent 4 months in a state of private diminishment, a man who felt he had nothing to offer anyone. Now he had tomatoes. It sounds trivial. It was not trivial. There is something about putting something in your neighbor's hands that you grew with your own effort, in your own small piece of earth, that is not trivial at all. It is, in fact, one of the oldest human gestures there is. The family upstairs, the Garcias, Maria and Tom and their 2 young daughters, invited him for dinner the following week. He went. He had not sat at someone else's dinner table in 8 months. He had forgotten, in those 8 months, that a dinner table with other people at it is a fundamentally different object than a dinner table alone. He stayed for 3 hours. He helped the girls with a puzzle after dinner, while Maria and Tom cleaned up and talked in the kitchen. He walked home in the dark and stood in his apartment and felt, for the first time since any of it had begun, something that was not the absence of things, but the presence of something new. He did not have a name for it yet. He did not need one yet. The second installment arrived in August, in the form of a phone call from Emma. His older daughter called on a Sunday morning, which was their regular time, but the call was different from the careful, loving, slightly anxious calls of the previous months. She was calling with news. She had been promoted. She had been offered a project lead role on something she described with the excited, slightly breathless speed of someone who has been holding good news in for days and can finally let it out. He listened. He asked questions. He felt, as he listened to his daughter's voice, genuinely happy for her, not the effortful, dutiful happiness of a man performing the correct parental response, but the real thing. The happiness that comes from loving someone and watching something good happen to them. He had been so deep inside his own losses that he had not, for months, had the emotional space to be genuinely happy about something outside himself. The capacity had come back without his noticing it coming. "Dad," Emma said at the end of the call, "you sound different." "Do I?" "You sound like yourself again," she said. "You sound like Dad." He did not say anything for a moment. "I'm working on it," he said. "I can hear that," she said. "I'm glad." He hung up and sat in the kitchen for a long time. Outside the window, the morning was doing its unhurried, indifferent, beautiful thing. The light moving across the rooftops, a pair of birds on the wire, the sound of the city waking up. He was still here. That was the thing. After everything, he was still here, and the morning was still happening, and his daughter was still in the world being his daughter. And somewhere 6 blocks away, a rectangle of earth was growing things he had planted with his own hands. He was not the man he had been 2 years ago. That man was gone. The man with the title and the house and the marriage and the particular set of certainties that had come with all of those things. He was not going to be that man again. That chapter was finished. But he was beginning to understand, in the way you understand things that arrive through living rather than thinking, that the end of a chapter is not the end of the book. The third installment, the one he had not seen coming, arrived on a Saturday morning in September. He was at the garden as he was every Saturday. The morning was cool with the first edge of autumn in it, the light coming in at a lower angle, the colors of the plot shifting from the full green of summer toward the more muted, complex palette of the turning season. He was doing the end-of-season work that Ruth had taught him, clearing spent plants, amending the soil for winter, preparing the ground for what would come next year. Ruth arrived later than usual. She walked through the gate with the careful, deliberate movement of someone who is managing something and not quite managing it, and Robert looked up and saw immediately that she was not all right. "Ruth," he said. "I'm fine," she said, which was exactly what he had been saying for a year, and which he now recognized as what it was. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He brought her water from the communal tap. He crouched beside her on the bench and waited, in the way she had taught him without knowing she was teaching him, without urgency, without performing concern, simply present. She had been to the doctor the previous week, she told him. There was something in her hip. She had known about it for a while, but had been, in the way of people who have survived a great deal and have developed perhaps too high a tolerance for managing things alone, not quite dealing with it. The doctor had now told her it needed dealing with. Surgery, likely, followed by months of physical therapy. She would not be able to come to the garden for the winter, possibly longer. "The plot," she said, with the specific distress of a person whose concern for something they tend runs deeper than is strictly rational. "I can't leave it." "I'll tend it," Robert said. She looked at him. "I mean it," he said. "I'll look after your plot. I know it. I've been watching you work it for 8 months. "It's particular," she said. "The north corner needs extra drainage and heavy rain, and the garlic goes in by the end of October, whether the soil feels ready or not," he said. "I know." She was quiet for a long moment, and then, very slowly, Ruth smiled. It was not a large smile. It was the restrained smile of a woman who has been largely self-sufficient for 19 years and finds the experience of being looked after both unfamiliar and deeply welcome. "You've been paying attention," she said. "I had a good teacher," he said. The winter that followed was the most purposeful Robert had experienced in 2 years. He tended both plots through the cold months. He planted Ruth's garlic in late October as instructed, pressed the cloves into the amended soil with a care that he recognized, slightly to his own amusement, as something approaching tenderness. He mulched both plots against the frost. He checked on them twice a week through December and January, more than was strictly necessary, because the checking gave his weeks a shape they would not otherwise have had. He visited Ruth, not out of obligation, out of genuine liking for her company, which had grown over 8 months from respectful acquaintance into something he would have called friendship without hesitation. He brought her things from the garden when there was anything left to bring. He sat in her kitchen, which was small and ordered and full of plants on every windowsill, and they drank tea and talked about the garden and about the things the garden led them to talk about, which were really everything. She told him about her husband David, a civil engineer who had died at 62 of a heart attack while mowing the lawn on a Sunday afternoon, which she described with the dark, fond humor of a woman who has had 14 years to find the absurdity in the tragedy, alongside the tragedy itself. She told him about rebuilding after, about this garden finding her on a February morning, just as it had found him, about the years of slow relearning what it meant to be a person without the specific shape she had inhabited for 30 years. He told her things, too, about his daughters and the Sunday calls, and the way Emma had said, "You sound like yourself again," about the Garcias upstairs, and the puzzle with the girls, and the dinner table, and the strange, simple power of sitting at someone else's table, about what it had felt like, that first Saturday, to have somewhere to be. "That's the whole of it, really," Ruth said one evening, having somewhere to be. It sounds so small. It is everything. In February, Ruth came back to the garden. Not at full capacity. The hip was better, but not entirely, and she moved with a new caution that she accepted with the same unsentimental pragmatism she brought to everything. But she came back. She walked through the gate on a cold Tuesday morning and stood at the edge of her plot and looked at it. The garlic was coming up. Small, determined green shoots pushing through the winter soil with the unhurried confidence of things that know exactly what they are doing. "You planted it right," she said. "I had instructions," he said. She looked at him. And then she did something he had not seen her do in 8 months of knowing her. She reached out and put her hand on his arm, just for a moment. The brief, direct gesture of a woman who does not make that gesture lightly and means everything by it. "Thank you, Robert," she said. He nodded. He did not trust his voice entirely. They worked side by side in the thin February light. Two people who had each lost what seemed like everything, and had each found, in a rectangle of earth beside a river, something they had not known they were looking for. Robert Callahan is 63 years old now. He is still in the apartment on the east side of Portland. It does not feel characterless anymore. He has lived in it long enough for it to take on his character, which is what apartments do when you stay in them and stop treating them as temporary. He has not returned to corporate project management. What he has done, quietly and without planning it as a reinvention, is become the person people at the garden call when something needs organizing. When the irrigation system needed upgrading, they called Robert. When the city opened a dialogue about a youth program, they sent Robert to the meetings. When new plots opened and applications doubled, Robert built the fair allocation system that prevented the argument everyone had been expecting. He did not seek any of this. It found him, the way the garden had found him, by being there, consistently, with his attention and his capability and his willingness to show up. He did not seek any of this. It found him, the way the garden had found him, by being there, consistently, with his attention and his capability and his willingness to show up. Emma came to visit in the summer, and he took her to the garden on a Saturday morning, and she walked the path between the plots and looked at what her father had grown and built, and she did not say anything for a long time. When she did speak, she said, "I didn't know you could do this." And he said, "Neither did I." Lily came in the fall, and Ruth made them all tea in her kitchen, and the four of them sat around the small table. And Lily told a story about a disastrous camping trip that had them all laughing in the specific, easy way of people who are comfortable enough together for laughter to come without effort. Lily drove home afterward and called him from the road and said, "Dad, I really like her." He knew who she meant. He said, "So do I." He thinks about the 14 months sometimes, the long fall of it, the job, the marriage, the house, the self. He does not think about it with regret exactly, or with the complicated pride of someone who has survived something and wants credit for surviving. He thinks about it the way you think about weather that is past, with a clear-eyed acknowledgement that it happened, that it was difficult, that it changed the landscape. The landscape is different now. He is different now. Not better than he was, not worse, different. The man he is at 63 has things the man at 59 did not have: a community, a skill, a quieter relationship with his own worth that does not depend on a title or a salary or the particular shape of a life that other people can recognize and approve of. He thought, in the worst of it, that he had lost everything. He had, in the narrow sense, lost a great deal. But what he had found, on a February morning on a river path, through a gate, in a rectangle of hard winter dirt, was not less than what he had lost. It was different. It was smaller in some ways and larger in others. It was more honestly his. And Ruth, who had found the same gate on a different February morning 19 years before him, Ruth, who had handed him a spade and told him that dirt and potential were the same thing from the right angle. Ruth was the surprise. Not a romantic surprise, though the girls would perhaps disagree. a human surprise. The surprise of a person who arrives in your life at the exact moment you have concluded, quietly and not quite consciously, that the best of what life gives you is already behind you. She had been growing things beside a river for 19 years, waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for a man who needed to learn what she knew. He had been walking a river path for 4 months, waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for exactly that. Life had one more surprise. It always does. The mistake is deciding, in the middle of the loss, that you already know how the story ends. You do not know how the story ends. No one does. That is the whole point. That is, when you are finally still enough to hear it, the most beautiful thing.